Download Whiskey Hell Podcast. We call attention to the mainstream media narratives weekly in hopes that you'll have fun with how ridiculous the news really is. We don't want to change your mind. We just want to give you perspective so that you can choose more wisely and be more aware. Couple that with great craft beer, hilarious stories, deep thoughts, and real conversations. We know you're going to enjoy it. Download Whiskey Hell Podcast anywhere you find outstanding shows.
Take my eyes open to force reality. Why can't you just let me eat my weight in glee? Hush.
Hello, World Ablaze listeners. Welcome to episode 36. We're starting to get up there. Getting closer to 50. Which I guess is a landmark for most newer shows, but we're not stopping anytime soon, so I don't see that as being an issue. And before we begin, I want to get a few things out of the way. Firstly, must apologize. Did not get my usual mid-week release out to you. Life happens, been busy. And so therefore, I'm here on this day, Saturday, August 17th, around 6 in the morning, recording. It's nice and cool out here right now, so I got everything open in Studio A, got the doors and the windows just to get the nice breeze in here, as it will be hotter later today, as it has been out here where I live in the summer. Also, I need to give a shout out to Whiskey Hell. The guys at Whiskey Hell gave us a mention, and they've been supportive of World Ablaze. And I want everybody who listens to this show to please check Whiskey Hell out. They've been around a while. They definitely have a following. I'm sure that they're a much bigger show than I am at this point. But regardless, if you haven't heard them, please search for them in your favorite podcast app. Whiskey Hell, great guys. They talk about news, politics, and current events from a very sensible perspective. And they also sample craft beers from microbrews to maybe larger breweries you haven't heard of. But very cool. You get to learn a little thing about, beers. May discover some good ones that you may have never heard of before. They may become your favorites. And at the same time, they know what they're talking about when it comes to current events. So support Whiskey Hell. With that being said, I think, well, firstly, let me say this. We are going to talk about Kamala. How can we not? Election season. DNC is coming up Monday, August 19th. And so, yeah, Kamala is the topic today. Specifically, her wanting to put further restrictions on your right to bear arms or right to even own guns. And I'm going to go down the rabbit hole of that whole issue and, why is she so wrong and why you should be worried. Now, I do have, to get me through the episode, I do have my espresso. I actually got I think I got about 5 shots of espresso in this this cocktail I have here this morning. And because I feel like it, and I do like a fine cigar in the morning, I'm going to be lighting up the Tabernacle over here by Foundation Cigars. But let me get my cutter ready. I think I'm going to go ahead and put a V-cut on this because I do prefer a V-cut. All right, got that cut. Now it's time to light this sucker. I'm going to grab my flame torch lighter here, and here we go, and there we are. I'm going to toast this up, and I know I don't normally do this on the show. I've done it a few times, but I am a cigar smoker, and I enjoy a fine cigar, and today just felt like it was a cigar day, definitely a cigar morning, and with a pairing of a good espresso. So here I go, little pregame here. That looks good. Take a puff, and then I'll move on. Yep. Do yourself a favor if you haven't had a cigar by Foundation Cigars. By the way, I'm not endorsed by these guys whatsoever. It's just they kind of become my go-to lately. Haven't had a bad smoke, so check them out. Usually I smoke the Olmecs. Actually, pretty much almost anything they make, but I got to say this Tabernacle is awesome. All right. With that out of the way, hold on. Let me get a little coffee in me. A little espresso. Okay. With that out of the way, let's get to Kamala. So Kamala Harris believes that it's her life's mission, and she thinks she's going to win over voters by pushing the issue of guns, how guns are dangerous, how the population, well, really doesn't need guns. Now, she hasn't outright said that, but she has more than implied that by stating she wants to, within her first 100 days as president, if Congress doesn't pass more restrictive laws, that she herself will pass an executive order to do so. It's been heard that, well, she's been heard saying that she has no problem taking away everyone's guns. Why is this an issue? It's an issue because one of the things that keeps a government in check is really the fear of its own people. Now, people realize and understand we need a government. We need a governing body. There are things that are too big for all the people to get together and manage and handle. So a governing body is really, it's kind of like a CEO of a company. They're voted in based on their experiences and merits and what they think they can do to steer the ship of the company. The United States of America is a pretty large organization, and we need the right person in charge to do so. But just like a CEO where their job is based on performance and their pay is based on incentives, that is one of the things that keeps the CEO in check. And one of the things that keeps the president or the government in general in check is the fact that its citizens are very heavily armed. Now, in our history, there's only been a few uprisings against the British government, and that was done in an effort to create our own country and declare our own independence. And we had a civil war, which was North versus South, very bloody. Probably one of the worst wars in our history. So since then, we really haven't had an issue where the citizens felt it was bad enough to take up arms and rise up against their government. And because we have the right to bear arms and we are, as a population, armed and at the ready, our government hasn't been able to overreach and do things that would turn them into basically a tyrannical government where they have complete and total control of everything you do, down to how much food you can purchase, what you're allowed to spend your money on, etc. Although recently, it would seem that there have been attempts to do those things in an indirect way. But still, the fear of its people is what keeps our government in check. And guns are a very, very big reason why that is. In fact, it's a tool used for hunting, for food, and of course, for protection of oneself and for the people against its own government, if need be, and against any foreign entities that wish to cause harm. Now, the disarmament of the people has always led to catastrophic results and has led to the result of a tyrannical or dictatorial government. And some examples definitely come to mind, such as the USSR or Russia. There was Nazi Germany. There was Venezuela, Argentina. And those are just a few. We can even go as far back as the Ottoman Empire. And then in more modern times, other examples where this has been implemented and may not have turned out to be as bad yet, but where governments are definitely imposing more and more radical socialist agendas and views on its people. We must also bring up the UK. We also must bring up Australia and Canada, which is who seem to be well on their way to becoming very tyrannical under the leadership of Justin Trudeau. And with the removal of guns, things such as free speech go away, the control of your money goes away, and those are just the two things that stand out probably the most to people, but also consider the control of your food. It can get to a point where it is so bad that a nation could easily become North Korea. And I'm sure that is something that every person who is a member of a free nation absolutely doesn't want. Now, you may say, what does all that have to do with Kamala Harris? Well, Kamala very much wants to impose your right to bear arms, your ability to own a weapon, and she's even been caught saying she wants to impose mass registration. The problem with mass registration of weapons is really giving the government a list of known individuals that they can go to easily confront and disarm. Kamala believes in this so wholeheartedly that I have a clip here from 2020 when she was running for president against Joe Biden. And she made a statement where even Joe Biden himself was in disagreement of. In fact, he blatantly told her that that's not possible and it's not constitutional. Now, this clip is just one example of Kamala Harris stating what she believes. She's not hiding it. And this was in 2020 when she so much wanted to be president. And her beliefs haven't changed since. But let me go ahead and play this clip for you.
They said, I'm going to issue an executive order. Biden saying there's no constitutional authority to issue that executive order when they say I'm going to eliminate assault weapons, saying you can't do it by executive order any more than Trump can do things when he says he can do it by executive order. Does the vice president have a point there?
Some things you can, many things you can't.
Let's let the senator answer.
Well, I mean, I would just say, hey, Joe, instead of saying no, we can't, let's say yes, we can.
Let's be constitutional. We got a constitution.
And yes, we can.
So even after being told to her face it's unconstitutional, that you can't do that, she laughs in the face of everybody up there and says, no, you can. As if to say, well, I'm going to, regardless of what you think. Now, she tries to justify her tyrannical communist rhetoric by always pointing to gun violence in America and mass shootings and keeping kids safe. And those are logical. They're logical statements. They're logical things that we should all be concerned with. But as with most things that come out of the mouths of people like Kamala Harris, they're absolutely taken out of context and blown out of proportion. And of course, if anybody knows anything about me on the show, I call people out on their shit, and I'm not afraid to read the data in support of my statements. But before I do so, I need another puff. That is a great cigar. And so, now that was back in 2020, she made that statement, and she made it again a little bit later on the same campaign when she was trying to run for president. I'm going to play that clip.
With universal background checks and a renewal of the assault weapon ban. But they have failed to have the courage to act. So, Ben, here's my response to you. Upon being elected, I will give the United States Congress 100 days to get their act together and have the courage to pass reasonable gun safety laws. And if they fail to do it, then I will take executive action. And specifically, what I will do is put in place a requirement that for anyone who sells more than 5 guns a year, they are required to do background checks when they sell those guns. I will require that for any gun dealer that breaks the law, the ATF take their license. And by the way, ATF, alcohol, tobacco, and firearms. Well, the ATF has been doing a lot of the A and the T, but not much of the F. And we need to fix that.
Again, Kamala Harris stating that within her first 100 days, if Congress doesn't do what she asks them to do, then she will pass executive orders to put further restrictions on gun ownership and the ability to bear arms. Now, she says some things, as most politicians do, that kind of makes sense, right? I mean, who doesn't want universal background checks? I mean, if you're going to buy a firearm, of course you want a background check. Why wouldn't you want a background check on something that could be potentially a dangerous weapon in the hands of a person who shouldn't have one? But it always comes down to, again, taking things out of context. I'm going to read something about universal background checks. Here's an article that I got from the National Firearm Industry Trade Association. It's nssf.org. They did an investigation, and in their investigation, here's some things that they, this is what they came up with, and this is their findings. It states, if universal background checks were mandated, the question becomes whether criminals would change their behavior and instead choose to obtain firearms from FFLs, or federally licensed firearms dealers. Okay, so let me stop there and break that down, because the statement makes sense. It's true. Just because you mandate these background checks, which, by the way, I'm not against. I think there should be mandated background checks if you want to buy a gun. We need to know that the people buying guns are mentally sound and are not individuals with extremely violent pasts. We absolutely need to know what's going on. We also need to know if it's a person that, hey, might be dumb enough to try this, and guess what? They're flagged for being a known terrorist. These things do happen. But the Firearm Industry Trade Association is correct in their statement. It's not going to stop criminals from pursuing the purchase of guns elsewhere. They're not going to just suddenly go, well, I guess now it's mandated, I'm going to have to go to a dealer to buy my gun or my weapon of choice. No, they'll continue to buy them on the black market. They're going to continue to steal them. They're going to continue to find ways to get the guns into their hands. So reading on further, it says the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention review of the effectiveness of various firearm laws published in 2003 found no evidence this would happen. Again, as I said earlier, there's no evidence whatsoever criminals are just going to stop being criminals and trying to find guns in an illegal fashion. They're going to still do it regardless of mandates. But again, I do support the fact that we need universal background checks. Okay, it says that more recently, in 2013, the Justice Department review of violence prevention studies found that even a perfect universal background check system would not address the largest sources of crime guns or guns used in crimes. Further, the study found that effectiveness would depend on requiring gun registrations. Now that right there, requiring gun registrations, which is absolutely something that Kamala has been behind, is kind of a bad thing. If you're going to go through the background check, we already know whether or not you should be able to have a firearm. The gun registration thing, it's a bit sticky. Now, I know we have to register our cars. I'm sure there's people going to make some arguments on why we should register firearms because, hey, they can be considered a weapon. Well, being that I think out of the box, and I've had, martial arts training, and that growing up I had to know how to really defend myself, I tend to look at things at times that could be used as weapons in a worst case scenario. So if we have to register guns, then we need to register shovels, axes, pickaxes. How about handsaws, hammers? I mean, almost any garden tool. Let's register kitchen knives. I mean, do you see where I'm going with this? Registrations are nothing more than a list the government can use to identify who has the weapons, who they need to go to in order to disarm those individuals. That is the danger of a national registration or a mandated registration of firearms, because technically anything can be made a weapon. And I'm going to go over that later on in the episode when we start talking about murder and how it compares in the U.S. to countries that, don't have guns. So reading on the article from the Firearm Industry Trade Association, it says here that additional evidence that universal background check law would fail to limit access to firearms among prohibited populations can be found in an analysis of the implementation of the Brady Act. According to 2000 study, there was no evidence that implementation of the Brady Act was associated with the reduction in homicide rates. And again, as I just stated earlier, I'm going to go over that in this episode. Now, they go on to make more of an opinion here, but their statement I kind of agree with. Well, actually, I do agree with it. And they make a statement here saying that ultimately the goal of registration for anti-gun advocates is confiscation law, abiding owners' firearms. And I agree with that because that's exactly what the goal of the registrations are. Further says the strategy is historically present in many countries as far back as Nazi Germany, which I mentioned earlier, to modern day Australia, the United Kingdom, Venezuela, and most recently Canada. So there you have it. Studies have been done on whether or not these mandates make a difference, and, well, they don't. And now, again, I'm not saying we don't need universal checks. I mean, that absolutely makes sense. But there isn't a need for the registration of all gun ownership. And there isn't any evidence that even by doing universal background checks that it's going to reduce the sales of guns. I mean, I'm going to use this as an example. It's a loose example, but we all know that marijuana has been made legal in pretty much almost every state. Pretty much started here in California. The legalization of marijuana did not stop or kill off the black market of marijuana sales. In fact, to this day, thousands and thousands and thousands, maybe tons and tons of pounds of marijuana are still imported, smuggled illegally into the U.S. and sold on the streets. Because even though marijuana was made legal, the legal retail side of marijuana, while the prices themselves are so high because of all the regulation, red tape, and money the government wants as a kickback to make it legal, that people are still turning to the black market to get affordable marijuana. Now, again, marijuana is not a gun, but still an example of how further mandating things doesn't eliminate a person's ability to buy what they need or attain what they need in an illegal fashion on the black market. Now, so far, I really hope I'm making sense here. Okay, again, universal background checks, sure, why not? But giving the government a comprehensive list of people who actually own firearms and confiscate those firearms from those people who may use them to actually live by hunting for their food and protecting themselves is wrong. It is absolutely wrong. And once we allow that, what's going to stop them from, as I said earlier, making you register for other frivolous items that they deem dangerous and unnecessary for you to own and use in any manner you see fit? Again, universal background checks, great. Registrations, no. Now, her other claim, and what she alluded to by stating, well, any legal firearms dealer caught violating the law and providing false information, they should have their licenses revoked and fined, etc., possibly even jailed. Now, Kamala, slow your fucking roll here, okay? Firearms dealers can't necessarily control whether or not the information provided by an individual is in fact true. And the whole reason to have background checks is for the governing agencies who actually run and screen these people based on the information given, is so that it could be fact-checked and so they can find out whether or not this individual is legitimately who they say they are. So how is that the burden of the firearms dealer? Most firearms dealers aren't selling guns illegally, intentionally. There's a thing called straw purchases, which relates to those individuals who were actually hired by drug cartels and other gangs and dangerous individuals who have a clean, perfect record, but get paid by these cartels and gangs to purchase these legal firearms, which are then taken and smuggled across the borders or put into the hands of these dangerous individuals. Now, you can't blame the dealers for this. These are just criminals being criminals. Criminals will always find a way. Just as in the days of Prohibition, when they outlawed alcohol, bootleggers still figured it out and people still consumed alcohol. It's not something you're going to stop. just as your war on drugs never worked. And drugs are still sold illegally in an enormous, ungodly amount to the tune of trillions and trillions of dollars. So let's stop trying to put a Band-Aid on the crack of the dam here. And let's concentrate on the real issue, which is criminal organizations and the black market. Here's a report from the ATF. I got this from the ATF government website. I'm just going to read a little bit about firearms, the amount of that have been documented in trafficking. It states here, the ATF firearm trafficking investigations documented nearly 230,000 firearms trafficked in 7,779 cases between 2017 and 2021. It says most firearm trafficking investigations involved the diversion of relatively small number of firearms with an overall mean of 16 firearms trafficked per investigation. So, again, firearms trafficking. And I got to be honest, if I'm reading that number, we roughly have 330 million individuals in the United States of America. That's our population. And 230,000 firearms over the course of 2017, 18, 19, 20, 21. I mean, 4 or 5 years, correct? So that's not really a lot if you look at it from that perspective. But I'm not justifying gun trafficking. Okay, of course, that's illegal. That's not what we want. But these aren't all the real numbers. Now, what I found when I was doing a little bit of investigating on this issue is that it got harder and harder to tie the actual amounts of firearms to what the ATF considers trafficking channels. Trafficking channels being, weapons or guns sold by actual legitimate dealers, but they're selling it knowingly and illegally, to guns that are illegally imported into the United States for sale, to guns that are stolen from individuals. You name it. They really break down drug trafficking by specific categories. And when I was searching for this, and honestly, the ATF did put out a report this year, 2024, on gun trafficking and gun sales, but they always referred to everything by cases in which they found guns were trafficked. They don't necessarily always point to an actual amount of guns per case and or per trafficking channel. Now, they allude to it a little bit later, but it doesn't seem so accurate, as you're going to find out later in this show. So let's start with firearm trafficking channel types. This is directly from the report that was taken from the ATF, and this data was taken during the time period of 2017 and 2021. This will be part 3 of the report, Firearm Trafficking Channels and Methods Used. And I'm going to read the firearm trafficking channel types. So it says here that the survey completed provided 18 options to select from as a type of trafficking channel, including a category labeled Other. Okay, so there can be more than one trafficking channel cited per case. Now, again, as I said, they try to make the numbers and percentages more about cases. And I think this is done intentionally to overwhelm people who don't want to dig deeper into what's being said. But regardless, this is how they conducted their report. So let's go over those trafficking channels that they have identified. There are trafficking firearms by unlicensed dealers or private persons. There are trafficking in firearms by a straw purchaser, as I mentioned earlier, or straw purchasing rings. So it could be a gang or group of people who intentionally go out to purchase these firearms for individuals, gangs, and other illegal organizations. There's also trafficking in firearms by methods of being stolen from a licensed dealer. Okay. There's a trafficking in firearms by theft from private persons. There's illegally exported from the United States to other places. So These are firearms that are actually exported from the USA. I'm going to go over that later because there's a lot to that. It's not what you might think in your mind, as in dealers or people buying guns legally and then illegally exporting them as individuals. It's actually more or less driven by and funded by the Mexican drug cartels. So very important for you to keep that in the back of your mind. Okay. There's also online marketplaces. There's unlicensed makings. Not really sure about what they mean by that, but there's also gun shows, flea markets, or auctions, social media platforms. Basically, they're just identifying different marketplaces where things are sold illegally or under the table. There's also peer-to-peer applications illegally imported into the United States. And then, of course, that's interesting because they don't really talk about that much. And then there's also stolen from common carriers. So when they're in transport, they're stolen. Either way, it seems like most of this has to do with illegal methods. And one of the bigger ways that they are obtained is honestly through these straw purchases. Now it says here, unlicensed dealers or private persons make up 40% of all the cases that they found between the periods of 2017 and 2021. But straw purchasing rings come in second at 39.5%. Now, what I do question here, because again, these are percentage of cases. What they are not telling you is percentage of or amount of guns or weapons in each trafficking channel that has been identified. Because the exportation of guns, in which I mentioned earlier about it being driven by and funded by the Mexican cartels, is actually very big and very lucrative for the Mexican cartel. So there's a little bit of skewed data. But they did do the report, and at least they're identifying the issues, which is a good thing, because now we know where to start and where to focus. Now, in part 4 of the report, labeled Source to Market, they go over sources, as in how these firearms are being moved around or where they're coming from. States here that the term source to market type captures the geographic scope of firearm trafficking cases. Again, the word cases. Because that's what they want to focus on. How many cases? Not necessarily the total number. And again, I've scoured this report. They do eventually come to a point where they mention a number of firearms. But again, I found them to be inaccurate when I dug deeper. But again, let's stick to the report here. So let me back up. So the term source to market type captures the geographic scope of firearms trafficking cases, which include intrastate, interstate, and international trafficking. Within the U.S., intrastate trafficking involves the movement of firearms in markets within states, while interstate trafficking occurs between states. And then international trafficking involves the movement of firearms in markets between the U.S. and a foreign country. So it says here in the report that the percentage of cases that are related to intrastate are 55.9%. Number of cases related to interstate is 32.1%. And then U.S. to foreign is 19.2% of cases, and foreign into the U.S. is only 1.4%. Now, these are percentages of cases, not amount of weapons. Very important for you to realize that, because it's easy to say by looking at this, wow, look how many cases they have of illegal firearm sales within the United States itself. We definitely have an internal problem when it comes to firearms. But the problem with this data and this report in general is it doesn't touch enough on the amount of firearms per case, and are those firearms necessarily that are being moved around in the United States, do they stay in the United States, and do they remain in the hands of people within the United States? Very important distinction here. Now, the next section I'm going to read here is part 5, and they go over in this report the type and volume of firearms trafficked, and I'm going to read the top 3 types of firearms that have been trafficked. So there are new firearms, make up 65.8% of total cases. And again, this is from the period 2017 to 2021. In second, there are second-hand firearms, which make up 39.8%. Now, second-hand obviously being sold by private individual. I don't even know if it could just also have been handed down to somebody for inheritance or just given to another person. But these are weapons that were moved outside of, I would assume, a legal dealer. And then the third is stolen firearms. So let's not forget, there are still plenty of firearms being stolen. Now, I do have to say it's a little alarming that most of all firearms that are being trafficked are new firearms. And now we got to ask ourselves, well, how are those being obtained? Again, that correlates back to straw purchases or straw purchasing rings. And as I defined earlier, it is individuals or gangs of people that are hired due to their perfect record. They pass the background checks, and they're paid by cartels and other criminal organizations to purchase these weapons from legal dealers and then recirculate them into the black market. Now, so far, it's easy to surmise that Kamala Harris's crazy, vengeful stance against the American people and trying to disarm them really doesn't make any sense, because thus far in this report by the ATF, everything having to do with gun sales and illegal gun sales are, well, actually done by illegal methods. So far, it hasn't been proven that legal gun dealers are just willingly illegally selling and flooding the market with guns. In fact, further on in their report, they have a section labeled investigation outcomes. And I like this part because they actually get down to the meat and potatoes of this report and kind of contradict themselves, because so far everything has been, percentage of cases by trafficking source. And they did label a large percentage being associated with gun dealers. But in this figure 10-02, which is number and percentage of cases by top 10 statutory violations, it paints a different story here. In this report, it says that 35.3% of all cases had to do with dealing in firearms without a license. So individuals, not legal firearms dealers, but basically dealing firearms without a license. And obviously most of this is due to under-the-table sales and done by means of black market sales. And that made up 35.3%. 28.9% was due to providing false info to acquire firearms from a dealer. Again, Kamala Harris wants to penalize the dealers for this false information that is being provided, but also realize that there are organizations being paid by cartels to figure out how to circumvent the system to acquire these firearms. So is it really the dealers who need to be put on trial here and have their licenses revoked and be fined and penalized and sent to jail? No. The bigger problem Kamala has here, and that the government has here, and that the people have here, is black market. So how do we effectively shut down black market sales? That's a great question. I don't have an answer for. I don't think anybody has an answer for, because, again, criminals are going to be criminals. Why are you going to go after and impose restrictions on people trying to legally purchase and obtain firearms? I guess the argument can be made, well, these straw purchasing rings do the same thing. They present themselves as legal individuals. Fair enough. But again, they're going through a background check, and there's no way to determine whether or not the information is correct except by the entity that is supposedly checking these applications. So who do we really hold accountable? The legal firearms dealer or the organizations that are processing these background checks? Now, that is where we may need to focus if we're going to get a handle on the illegal gun trafficking situation we have in the United States of America, not targeting citizens who want to own weapons for hunting, protection, and literally exercising their constitutional right to bear arms. Now, let me take another puff of my cigar here. Okay, so of all media outlets, CBS actually did a report on the Mexican drug cartels that were smuggling weapons across the border. Again, I mentioned this earlier, and this is why I kept alluding to the fact that in the report by the ATF and most people who spew the rhetoric of abolishing our Second Amendment rights, they never really tell you the amount of guns per trafficking channel. And in fact, the ATF report left it to percentage of cases, right? But again, when I went back to the firearms trafficking channels, supposedly those that were done by export or import were minuscule in terms of percentage of cases. But the reality is the Mexican drug cartels, and this report by CBS conducted in September of 2023, so last year, investigates this phenomena. I'm going to read some of this report here. It says Mexican drug cartels have been smuggling a vast arsenal of even military-grade weapons out of the U.S. with the help of American citizens. It says exclusively obtained U.S. intelligence documents and interviews with half a dozen current and former officials reveal that the American government has known this for years, but sources said it's done little to stop these weapons trafficking networks inside the United States. Well, that's interesting. So they know the issue has mostly been trafficking funded by the drug cartels, but they're not focusing on that. They're just focusing on citizens trying to buy guns legally and how they have to have more mandates and restrictions on your right to bear arms. Okay. Now, if that doesn't tell you what your government is about at this moment, I'm not really sure what else I will tell you that's going to convince you that we have a problem with people like Kamala Harris. But I'm going to keep reading this report by CBS. It says dozens of cartel gun running networks operating like terrorist cells pay Americans to buy weapons from gun stores and online dealers across the country as far north as Wisconsin and even Alaska. It says, according to U.S. intelligence sources, the firearms are then shipped across the southwest border through a chain of brokers and couriers. So again, the major problem we have with the drug trafficking epidemic or illegal gun sales is really fueled by criminal organizations like the Mexican drug cartels. And it states here that they have found that they were paying people in the U.S. to make these legal purchases. Well, these people are part of the straw ring organizations or even straw purchasers as individuals who are knowingly doing this illegally because the cartels are either making them do it or paying them to do it. The article further reads and alludes to a project labeled Project Thor, in which it found that the problem of cartel weapon smuggling was far worse than previously understood. They estimated that cartels were trafficking between, hold on for this, 250,000 and 1 million weapons every year with a retail value of up to $500 million. And that doesn't include ammunition and tactical supplies. Hold on. So already we're seeing a huge discrepancy because the ATF in their reports and press releases said that they've only, and again, this is all during the same time period, but they stated there was only 230,000 firearms trafficked in the 7,779 cases they found between 2017 and 2021. But CBS, doing their own investigative study, found that it was anywhere from 250 to over 1 million weapons being funneled through the black market system and illegal trafficking efforts by the drug cartels themselves. So yeah, we have an issue here. the U.S. government is obviously lying to us about our gun problem. They're lying to us about the trafficking issue, because if all the illegal black market sales of guns and trafficking are done in the U.S. and put back into the hands of the individuals living in the United States, then why are you trying to hide the real numbers? Are the 230,000 firearms that they reported, are those only the ones that stayed in the United States? Out of the 330 million people who live here, 230,000 were circulated within the United States? Well, that's not true, because when we read the report, they stated the percentage of cases that were interstate and intrastate, and they also have in the report a percentage that were imports and exports. So remember when I said that the percentage of imports and exports were much lower than those by interstate and intrastate? Sure. So this is why it was important for you to remember when I was saying that they were focusing on percentage of cases and not really number of weapons per case or per trafficking channel. It's obvious the bigger issue we have are illegal firearms being distributed and trafficked outside of the United States, meaning sent from the U.S. to illegal, corrupt organizations outside and then distributed that through the black market and throughout the world that way. So while we do have a gun trafficking issue, there is no evidence yet here that I've read that says are the citizens of the United States themselves. And in fact, I would even further be bold enough to say that if the drug cartels are involved in exporting these guns out of the United States, what percentage of those guns that remain in the United States aren't in fact just redistributed by the drug cartels to their organizations that are within our own borders? You see, the drug cartels do operate their own illegal gangs and organizations within the United States. We know this. So the data is skewed. The data has been put together to make you think that it's a good idea for the government to confiscate your weapons. Now, while you marinate on that, I'm going to play a clip that has Kamala Harris stating once again, and this is 2024, not 5 years ago. This is her 2024, literally last month in July, saying that she will take executive action to make sure there are further restrictions put on you, the people of the United States, to exercise your Second Amendment right to arm yourself, to be ready, God forbid if it ever did come to it, to defend yourself against the U.S. government. And let's not even go that extreme. Your right to even just have a firearm to protect yourself on your own land, to hunt for food. I mean, there are various other reasons why you would need a gun. It's not just for defending yourself against your own government, although that is, again, what is keeping our government in check. Here, let me go ahead and play this.
Adding to your gun control agenda? Yeah, I think it's a great idea. But I mean, listen, I don't think we lack for great ideas. As I've said many times, we've been having great ideas for decades. The problem is that Congress has not had the courage to act. And that is why, from the beginning, I have said, my agenda includes attempting to get Congress to act, but if they don't within the first 100 days of my administration, I'm going to take executive action. Because what we need is action.
Again, Kamala wants to take executive action because action is what's needed. You may be saying, well, she's not demonstrating anything there or saying anything that means she's wanting to take guns away from citizens. Fair enough, but here's another clip of Kamala Harris that you may find interesting.
Gun violence has terrorized and traumatized so many of our communities in this country. And let us be clear, it does not have to be this way, as our friends in Australia have demonstrated.
As I said earlier, and I mentioned countries that have, in more recent times, that stand out, taken guns away from their citizens. As I said, the UK, Canada, and Australia. Remember what happened to the Australian citizens during COVID? They were being punished, arrested, and patrolled by their own police forces to stay within their homes with their doors shut. They couldn't even go in their front yards within certain times without being punished or arrested. Another example how the people of a nation, without having the means to protect themselves, without the government fearing its own citizens, how that government can become tyrannical. Same thing in Canada. They removed the guns, then they removed your right to use your money how you wanted to. If everybody remembers the trucker convoy protests that took place in Canada, and what did the government do under Trudeau's reign? Well, they didn't have guns. The citizens didn't have any way to protect themselves whatsoever. There was no fear of their own citizens. And so they went after their bank accounts and shut down people's bank accounts where they couldn't fund the truckers. They wouldn't be able to pay for the truckers' wages while they were protesting, where the truckers themselves couldn't use their own money to purchase anything. So these are just examples that may be a little closer to home in terms of America, because we consider Canada, UK, Australia our close, brothers or cousins or sisters, wherever you have it. And let's not even forget what happened to Argentina and Venezuela way back when their guns were confiscated by voting for socialist leftist policies that eventually led to a tyrannical communist government. Now, here's a quote from Mao Zedong, also known as Mao Zedong. Now, I may have mispronounced that slightly, but he was the leader of China's Communist Revolution and served as the first chairman of the People's Republic of China, 1949 through 1959, and chairman of the Chinese Communist Party from 1931 through 1976. Now, he said, all political power comes from the barrel of a gun. The Communist Party must command all the guns. That way, no guns can ever be used to command the party. You want me to repeat that? And maybe I should. One more time. He said, all political power comes from the barrel of a gun. The Communist Party must command all the guns. That way, no guns can ever be used to command the party. That's a bit scary because it's sounding a little similar to the policies that are trying to be put in place by the Democratic Party of the United States, and very, very similar to Kamala Harris's take. Now, I'm not saying she's an outright communist. Well, maybe I am. But she's pretty adamant on not just restricting, but taking your guns. And the only reason to do so, the only reason any government would want to try to force or impose this is so that the government has control of their citizens, just as the Communist Party has done throughout history. Don't call it a coincidence when it is coincidentally extremely frequent. It is now a truth. It is no longer a conspiracy. This is reality. These are the dangerous times in which we live in. And we must pay attention. And this is why it's very important that we vote accordingly. Because behind the scenes, this is how it's going to happen. They take away the guns. Who has the guns? The government. Once you can't defend yourself, then they control the food and your money, which by then, I'm sure if this does happen, will be useless, just as it was useless in Argentina and in Venezuela. We're on a dangerous path here. The citizens have to recognize that the right to bear arms is not just some cliche American patriotic statement. The right to bear arms was intelligently and thoughtfully made a part of our Constitution for a very good reason. And that reason is to keep the government in check and to protect the citizens, protect our rights in maintaining the status of a free nation. But the government wants to further scare you. So even if you realize that you need your weapons to keep the government in check, they're going to play on your sympathies. And listen, murder and death is not okay. It's not good. So don't think that I'm advocating for any of that, but I gotta stick to the data and the facts. And as much as we don't want to hear the numbers and hear about people dying, I still have to go over this because facts matter. Data matters. And the Democratic Party and the Harris-Walz campaign has been telling you that they want to protect the children, that the mass shootings are just outrageous, and we wouldn't have these mass shootings if we just took guns away, that nobody would die. But there's some data that I need to go over. Now, the Brady organization did some studies on gun violence in America, and I've got data from this organization from their website, which is bradyunited.org. Well, who are these people? It says here that at Brady, gun violence is personal. From our founder to our namesakes to today, we are survivor-led. It's our legacy, it's our lineage, and it's our present. Many of our leaders and team members know firsthand the devastating toll gun violence takes. So this is an organization that takes gun violence serious. They definitely want to control it because gun violence isn't good, period. But their numbers, I think, are very important. The research they did in finding the percentage of gun violence in America based on types of violence is eye-opening and relevant to this discussion that we're having. So on their own website and their data, it says, again, going back to mass shootings are bad. Killing children is absolutely bad. But it's interesting to know that in Brady's own data, the Brady organization's own data, it says mass shootings make up only 1% of all gun violence in America. 1%. Yes, it's still bad. It's still the mass shooting of kids. I get it. But it's only 1%. It says here that 60%, this is important, people, 60%, more than 50, 60% of the gun deaths are actually suicides. 30%, less than 50, in fact, less than 40%, are homicides. And that percentage also includes 1% of the mass shootings. So if we take out mass shootings, it's 36% are homicides. Mass shootings are 1%. And the reason they classify that separately because it's not a thing. It's not a regular occurrence. As bad as it is, it's not an everyday occurrence. It's not a common event. It's not something that happens every day. And then it says 3% of gun deaths include law enforcement involved shootings, unintentional shootings, and those that were undetermined. Interesting data. So how much are guns contributing to deaths and homicides in America, especially when it comes to mass shootings? Now, mass shootings, I'm going to say a few things on that. Mass school shootings within the last, I want to say 5 years. I just did this data. I dug this up just recently. That most of all of them, now not all, I'm not saying all, but most, I'm going to say the majority for sure, factually for sure, and you can look this up, were actually done by those who were transitioning, people who were considered to be transgender. And these are kids who were transitioning. People whose hormones are out of whack, people who are insecure, unsure, and mentally unstable. And that's a harsh reality. So I'm gonna just throw this question out there to you. Are guns really the issue, or is it the person using the gun as a weapon? Is it really the gun, or is it really the mental instability of the person using the gun as a weapon? And you see, this is where we need to do better, because teenagers and kids don't just act without showing you signs that they need help or that they're reaching out for attention because there's an underlying issue that they can't solve. They always show you. The problem is most people don't know how to recognize it or flat out blatantly ignore it. And then one day things boil over and we have these tragic situations. And the first thing people do is point to the gun, when in fact it wasn't the gun. Murder rates don't go down because you take away guns. Now, I'll admit maybe the ability to execute poor choice of word there, I apologize, but basically the inability to kill people on a level of a mass shooting where there's multiple individuals at once dying within an event is going to be hard to pull off without a gun. I can admit that. But it's not going to stop people from being killed, as you're going to find out here shortly. I'm going to go over murder rates. Murder rates by population. So currently, and I took a lot of this data. Now, most data only goes up to 2022. Every so many years, they go back and they create more studies or new studies based on current data. But regardless, this stands. The USA currently has 330 million. It's really like 333 million or so. So if we did the numbers based on how many murders there were in the USA, and I'm going to also point out that these murders weren't all by gun. Okay, these are just murders. The total percentage of murders as of 2022 data in the United States was less than 1%. Out of 333 million people, less than 1%. In fact, it was 0.0064. Now compare that to the UK, where they took guns away from their citizens. You would think there'd be no murders. Now the population of the UK, which is far less, it's 67 million. They also have a murder rate of less than 1%. Now, murders didn't go away. Murders did not go away, even though they took away guns. Now, isn't that interesting? As I stated earlier, criminals will be criminals. They will find a way. The UK's percentage was 0.0010, of course, lower than the US, but they also have a smaller population. Regardless, both numbers are less than 1%. And less than 1% by just a little bit in the UK, which is a nation in where guns are taken from their citizens. Now let's go to Australia, because their data, last data they collected was in 2021. Now they only have 26 million people. That's it. Again, they have the lowest murder rate, still less than 1%. And it's less than the UK and the US. It's 0.0093. But again, murders didn't go away. So let's look at some of this data here. So I'm looking at data from Australia, for example. And the data on here is very similar to what you would find in the UK, where number of homicides are literally the highest percentage is done by sharp objects. So they're still finding ways to kill you. They're going to either do it by a knife, or they're going to fabricate a stabbing weapon, just like you hear about in prisons. You heard about shivs. Well, those are where prisoners actually make knives or stabbing objects out of just common materials. What's really interesting is the brutality here. Getting up close and personal to kill someone with a knife takes a lot more commitment than using a gun, period. A gun has the ability to kind of separate yourself from the act to a degree, because you could do it at a distance, but with a knife, you have to sit there and continually stab and cut and slash. You really have to show that you're committed in your mind to be able to pull this off, to kill another individual. But what I find interesting, in second place, the most common cause of murder is blunt force trauma by beating someone to death. That's right, beating someone to death. Do you want to be beat to death? Do you know what that's like? Have you ever been in a fight where you were ganged up on and were kicked and punched by multiple people? Can you imagine them not stopping to the point where you die? I would say that takes on another level of brutality. Okay? And this is very similar to the UK. The numbers may be different. The percentages may be different because of the size of populations. But in the UK and Australia, the leading cause of death is by sharp object or stabbing. And second, literally beating someone to death. Think about that. So taking away your guns has no effect on getting rid of murder whatsoever. And in each case, if you go by population, the percentages are extremely close in the US to the UK and to Australia. They're all very similar to each other in terms of percentages and those number of percentages, very close. The only difference is the amount of actual people, because again, we have 330 million or 333 million, and these other nations have 67 million and 26 million respectively. But still, 1%, less than 1% is still the percentage of homicides in each case. And taking away guns from the citizens did not eliminate murders. Period. So what's the reason then? Why does Kamala want to take your guns away? Again, it's for control. It's for control. It's because they do not want you to have the right to bear arms. And it's been proven that taking away guns is not going to eliminate murder, but at the same time, it does make it easy for the government to control you and impose their will on you, just as they did in Argentina and Venezuela and communist Russia, Nazi Germany, and the list goes on. The list goes on. So be very careful in supporting the Democratic Party right now. Be very careful in throwing all your support behind Kamala Harris, because she really does mean what she says. She's not hiding it from you. She is telling you. And I think that we need to be very smart about this. And yes, democracy literally is on the line this election. Now, I know this is all a lot of data and a lot of facts to absorb. And believe me, I can keep going. I mean, I haven't even dove into Venezuela and Argentina and how the nail in the coffin for those nations were when they gave up their weapons. And I can go back even further in discussing the occupations of the Ottoman Empire and how they also instituted the disarmament of their people. Once again, thanks so much for supporting the show. Please like, follow, and share. And hey, listen to other shows that are like us, such as Whiskey Hell, The Jesse Brzezinski Show, and the Stretch Goose Podcast.
I wanna taste your content, hold your breath and feel the tension. Devils hide behind redemption. Honesty is a one-way gate to hell.